So I'd like to thank all of you again for joining our Tuesday evening study session. And I was just saying that you must be getting sick of seeing me because of the weekend we had the Ho'onko service with the special lecturer as well. And then it just seems like one thing after another. So I've seen many of you maybe 3 or 4 times in the week. So but it's always nice to see all of you. So thank you for joining us. What I'd like to do tonight is we're going to start off with a quick chant, just like we did on the Saturday morning. We're going to be chanting the verses reaffirming the vows. And I'll explain why we do this afterwards, but I'll bring it up on the screen so that you'll be able to see it on the screen as well. Just pull it up here. Okay. So I'm just going to share it with everybody here. You can see that all right, I think. Okay. So we're going to be chanting the verses reaffirming the vows. And then right after that, we're just going to sit quietly for a few moments, a few minutes. Okay, so we'll start again with verses reaffirming the vows. As I mentioned on Saturday morning, for those of you who are here and those of you who aren't, this is an English chant that's been produced by the Hawaii Kyodan, the Hawaii Honganji Kyodan. And we use it on a weekly basis on Thursday nights for our Seiza meditation class. But basically, when we chant this, it's one syllable per beat, except for where there's a hyphenation, then it becomes 2 syllables in one beat. But it's pretty straightforward, so please join me in this chanting. Naman nubs, naman nubs, naman nubs, naman nubs. I have made unrivaled vows and will reach the highest path. If I fail in any way, may I not attain Buddhahood. Should I not provide to all for countless kalpas to come, aid in times of suffering, may I not attain Buddhahood. I will reach enlightenment, but unless my Buddha name resounds throughout the universe, may I not attain Buddhahood. I will practice the noble path, wisely, mindfully, free of greed. Seek to reach the supreme way. Be a guide to one and all. May my power shine great light to illumine and dispel the darkness of the three poisons, and save all from suffering. With eyes of wisdom I'll remove the darkness of ignorance. I will close all evil paths, open gates of highest good. When I attain Buddhahood, light will shine throughout all lands, light brighter than sun and moon, outshining all heavenly lights, giving my virtues to all, not forsaking anyone. I will proclaim the Dharma like the roar of a great lion, bowing before all Buddhas, steadfastly gaining virtues, with wisdom fulfilling my vows. I shall be a guide to all, like the wisdom of my teacher. May my wisdom also shine all throughout the universe, and illumine one and all. If I shall fulfill these vows, may all lands tremble with joy. From the heavens wondrous flowers rain down upon all the lands. Nama 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 The virtue of Amita's vow is shared equally by all, together attaining awakened mind. We are born in the land of peace. Naman Daos, Naman Daos. Okay, we're just going to sit for just a few minutes quietly. more nopes, no more nopes, no more nopes. So I will explain about this in just a little bit when we get to that section, but I'm just going to start talking now. I do have material written down, but I'm not going to bring it up on the screen at this moment. I don't want you getting caught up on watching just the words on the screen. What I will do though is after the lecture, I will send out what I've got to all of you, so you can have, you could take a look at it for your reference. So you don't have to worry about jotting down notes or writing notes or thinking that you're missing something, because I will send it to all of you after the talk. And I will bring up some stuff in just a little bit. But I just wanted to start off by reviewing just briefly what we covered last week, which was the 4 nutriments. And remember, I was saying how we take in various types of nutriments, whether it's actual physical nutriments or sense nutriments or our volition or our consciousness. So these are 4 types of things that we take in, and we can take in positive nutrients, or we can also take in toxins. And so when we were talking about the COVID-19, we were talking about how the virus is a toxin that we take in. And if we begin to understand it from this perspective, there are ways that we can deal with that as well. But one of the things I was having a little difficulty with understanding after I gave the talk last week was the fact that when we generally talk about the 4 noble truths, which we have been talking about from the beginning, the third of the 4 noble truths, the cessation of suffering. Okay, so in a very large, or how can I say it, overview of things, when we talk about the cessation or the riddance of suffering, basically the 4 major sufferings in life, the Buddha talked about birth, old age, sickness, and death. Interestingly enough, the Chinese character for birth, okay, also is understood to mean to live. It's actually the first character of my last name, Ikuta, right? Ikiru means to live, okay? So birth can also mean to live. So if we understand it from that context, then what the Buddha was saying is not only is birth suffering, but also to live is to suffer. Okay, so one of the things that when they talk about the 4 noble truths and the cessation of suffering, it goes much more than just saying the recovery from, say, COVID-19 virus, okay? Because COVID-19 virus, even if we conquer that, there's always still more illness, there's more suffering, okay? So sometimes though, when we look at it from a more larger perspective, we have a tendency, or we can lose sight of the actual event. So in this book by Thich Nhat Hanh, if you read this sequentially, you actually miss out some important things. So I actually skipped the Eightfold Noble Path and went to, at least on my book, it says part 3, other basic Buddhist teachings. And what's important, I think, is if you're reading this book, read that section as well. Just don't read it sequentially, because this back portion also has very important information in how to understand this Four Noble Truths. Okay. So one of the first section here on page 121, or in my book it says 121, it might be different depending on the version you might have, but it's chapter 17. It talks about the two truths, okay, the two truths. And that chapter talks about the fact that in Buddhism, they recognize, the Buddha talked about two truths. One is what we call the worldly truth, or samvrite satya, or in Japanese we say zokutai. Okay? And the other is what we call the absolute truth, the paramatta satya, or the shintai. Okay. So this worldly truth and absolute truth. Okay? So worldly truth is relative. It is the truth that says, yes, we would be very happy. The cessation of suffering in regards to the pandemic is when there is a cure for the pandemic, and we are no longer suffering from the effects of the pandemic. Okay? But that's relative because, as I said, even though that pandemic might be resolved, there's always the next pandemic coming up or a next illness coming up. Okay? Whereas the absolute truth, what it says is that it recognizes the fact that there is suffering in life, and that there's going to be physical suffering in life, but from a spiritual or a psychological perspective, one can control oneself so that you don't suffer as greatly. You can deal with it. Okay. But what often happens in the Buddhist teaching, and Thich Nhat Hanh also mentions this, is that some individuals or some teachers have a tendency to just jump to the absolute. And it gets very confusing because for us, and I don't know what you've been thinking when reading this, but some of it is very, very heavy to read. Philosophical or I know at times it's gotten me sleepy at times too, because the content is quite heavy, right? But Thich Nhat Hanh says, don't get so caught up in the doctrine or the dogma of things, because he said, and this is very true for Buddhism, they say that both these truths are very important, the worldly truth and the absolute truth. Because the only way that we ourselves can understand the absolute truth is through the worldly truth. Okay? So in other words, if we look at the pandemic, when we see the curing of the pandemic, then we begin to realize, okay, now that the pandemic is finished, am I completely feeling well? We might have a momentary sense of joy, but again, something else comes up. And then we begin to realize maybe there's something more than just our the happiness that's just right in front of us. And that's where we start searching for a more absolute. Okay? And there have been various descriptions or examples of this absolute versus the relative. Okay? One of them says that it's like two wheels on a chariot. Okay? They have to be in balance. If they're not in balance, then that chariot just goes around in circles because one wheel is stronger than the other. Okay? So both the absolute and the relative are both very important. Okay? When we think about the relative truths, other relative truths, for instance, another way of understanding it is the example that's often used is the lotus blossom in the muddy water, right? You've heard this analogy before, probably. The fact that the beautiful flower of the lotus only comes out in very muddy and murky water, right? It's not in a very clear running water. It's in these muddy ponds that the lotus blossoms. And what's often used as an analogy in Buddhism is the fact is that muddy pond represents what we call samsara, or suffering. And the beauty, the enlightenment of the Buddha comes out of that muddy pond, and which means that muddy pond is also necessary. So without suffering, in other words, there's no need for the Buddha, okay? Because we would all be enlightened, if you will. But because there is suffering, this is why the Buddha came out, okay? So similarly, this idea of the relative truth versus, or the worldly truth, relative truth versus the absolute truth is very important to understand. Another example that you might think of is food, hunger for food, right? Yeah, we all say this. Wouldn't it be wonderful, if you have a wonderful, beautiful meal, and if you can be satiated by that meal and not have to eat at all after that, but the very next day, what is it? You're hungry again, right? We're all like that. Incidentally enough, that's one of the benefits of going to what we call Amida's Pure Land, is that it says there, one only has to think about the food and they're satiated, okay? Don't have to go through the process of cooking and eating. But when we start, what happens is when we go through the cycle of hunger, eating, feeling full, getting hungry again, it makes us start thinking, right? Through that process, we begin to understand, wait, maybe there's something a little bit more to this than just our hunger. Okay. In fact, when we start thinking about our hunger, this is actually part of our greed. Because if it was truly just to get nutrients, then we could be eating the same thing day in, day out. But we would definitely get bored if we did that. We always want to have something that tastes good, right? So it's more than just receiving nutrients. We want something good. In fact, my dad used to tell us a funny story. When he was going to university in Toronto at U of T, he boarded with a Japanese-Canadian couple. And it was funny because this couple, so this is going back to the 1950s, early 1950s, I think. And so way back then, traditionally, it would have been the woman who made the meals, right? Of course, a very different world today, but back then, that was the norm, if you will. But the people that he was boarding with, the lady the wife of the couple, she was actually a very, very progressive individual. In fact, she was a businesswoman. She was a buyer for Hudson's Bay, I think it was. And so she had absolutely no interest in cooking or food. So my dad said that they had a regiment every week. So she had a schedule. And every week she followed the same schedule because she didn't like cooking. So I think he said something like Mondays was spaghetti night, and Tuesdays was sausage, and he knew exactly by the day of the week what was going to be served. And he said he remembers getting sick of it very quickly because every week it was the exact same thing, no variation to it, exact same thing over and over. So you see, by this example, we see that what we consider as our hunger is not just to get nutrients, but it's a part of our greed in that we want something that tastes good to me, right? So, but through this process of the relative truths, we can start thinking about the absolute. We can come in touch with the absolute through the relative truths. And the reason why this is important is that we begin to start thinking with the pandemic, okay, yes, we can get cured or we can find the vaccines, etc., to get over this particular pandemic, but it can also get us started to think about what is the root of our suffering. What is it that creates that suffering? And this is where we start thinking about more absolute terms. In the book, Thich Nhat Hanh, it also uses another analogy that's quite commonly used in Buddhism, and that's the analogy of the wave and the ocean, right? Where the wave is relative, and yet the water in the ocean is the absolute. So each particular wave is a phenomenal event. It's a relative event that's happening right now. But each wave can also get in touch with, it is part of the ocean, the water itself, if you will. So for us, we have to go through the relative waves, if you will, in order for us to understand we have this Buddha nature or this oneness that exists or that we come in contact with. So I'm going to bring up now, I'm going to show you now. Let's see, sorry. Okay. Okay, here we go. So this is actually a very famous pictures. These are actually used in this Zen school, okay? And this is the search for enlightenment. Can you all see this okay? Yes? Okay. Shall I blow it up a little bit more? Do you need to expand it a little bit more? Okay. So this is, in Zen Buddhism, there are 10 pictures in all, a series. And this is the search for enlightenment, okay? So you have this individual here in the first picture. He's lost his cow, okay? He's lost his cow. So he begins to search for his cow, okay? So he starts asking people for guidance as to where his cow might have gone. And then the next picture here, he sees in the distance a path, footprints of the cow. So you can see the footprints here. And then he sees the actual cow. And sometimes he sees the cow in the distance, sometimes it's much closer, but he sees it there. And then he actually gets right up to the cow, and he actually comes in touch with the cow, right? And he starts to tame or become closer and closer to the cow, to the point where he ends up riding the cow and playing this flute. And the next scene, you see the cow has disappeared, right? And then you get this empty void, and then you have this other scene where he's back with the cow. So this series, there's 10 diagrams, or was there 10? I think there's 10. 10 diagrams in all. This represents a search for enlightenment, or in the Zen school, for satori, awakening. Okay, and again, so what this is showing is the first one here, where he loses the cow. The cow represents what we call our Buddha nature, and all of us has this Buddha nature, or our absolute self. Okay, so at first he's lost sight of it, right? But then he starts on this journey, and he wants to find this cow, which is our absolute self, or the Buddha nature. And so he starts asking for guidance, right? So it will be somebody who starts on the spiritual search, if you will. Okay? So then he comes to these footprints, and what this is he starts seeing, oh, there's this thing called Buddhism, and he reads historical books, and he hears about the fact that there was this individual that existed, and he actually begins to see some stuff about Buddhism. At first, he's still not really in close contact with it, but as he's exposed more and more to it, he becomes more involved with it. He gets engaged with it. He touches it. He actually tries nurturing it. And then it comes when he really finds the in-depth value of it, he becomes one with it. Okay, so he's riding it now. He's one with the cow. But at one point, he goes beyond the teachings itself, and he no longer needs the cow. Okay, he's here by himself. Okay, then even that self is, and according to Zen Buddhism, even that self then disappears. So now he's gone even beyond. So before there was this. So at this point here, it's still the subject and object. They're two different things. Okay. And then at this point here, subject and object have become one. And now he doesn't even need the object. And now here, he's lost even the subject himself. He doesn't even need the self. Self is no longer there. However, and this is a very important point, you can't stop here. And so they say, in the end, he comes back to a realization the relative is also very important. Okay, so the absolute has to also include the relative. Okay, so this is what is showing in the final one. That if you just think of the absolute, then it's a very nihilistic way of thinking. But in fact, the absolute also encompasses the relative. So this is the idea of the wave and the ocean. Okay, it's not to deny the wave. The wave still exists very much. We see the waves. We can actually see waves, individual waves, right? So that also, there has to be a recognition of that as well. And so through the waves, we can also understand what the ocean is. And conversely, it doesn't negate the existence of the waves. So what this search for enlightenment is telling us is that in the spiritual search that we have, we go through this process of getting to know the absolute, but in that process, we begin to realize the relative is also very important. So our existence here is also very important as it is. So when we begin to learn about the teachings through this way, we begin to realize, okay, the truth of cessation of suffering. It is also important for us to understand that the cure from the pandemic is also, it may be relative in the fact that this is curing one illness and that there might be more illnesses coming, but nonetheless, curing this one illness is very important as well. So realizing that the joy from the cure of this one illness is also very important for us. Okay? And the reason why I brought this up was because sometimes we can get to the point, or Buddhism can get too philosophical, and where people say, okay, well, curing this illness is not really finding the true root of suffering. But in fact, through the curing of this one illness, we can understand about what it means to be whole, what it means to be cured, what it means to be healthy. And so through that, we find out a little bit more about the infinite as well. So that was the one thing. Now, in order to get to the understanding of the cessation of suffering, so the Buddha himself, he spent the time under the Bodhi tree to find enlightenment. And then actually, some of us took a lecture, a Japanese lecture this past Sunday. Very interesting lecture, by the way. And in that, this professor from Japan, Sasaki Sensei, was mentioning the fact that, when the Buddha first attained enlightenment, he had no intention of sharing it with others, right? That he didn't feel like, he didn't think that others would understand, first of all, the teaching. And so the Buddha was not going to share his experience with others. And it was only when he was pleaded to by the Brahma that he decided, yes, I will share this out of compassion for all sentient beings. But so when he, I lost my train of thought there for a second. So what he then had to do is once he attained enlightenment, the Buddha actually had to come up with, a system, if you will, how one can also experience the similar type of experience that he had, right? So this is how he came up with what we call the Four Noble Truths. And so these were truths, but as I mentioned before, they're not just an abstract truth that we try to memorize. They're actually a system for one to also experience the similar kind of awakening or similar experience that the Buddha himself experienced under the Bodhi tree. So for that, he came up with what we call the Noble Eightfold Path. Okay? And generally, this is how we normally, when you see it as a list, you see it written like this: right view or understanding, right thought, right speech, right action or conduct, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Right? That's how you normally would see it listed. But in fact, it's not really in this linear list. It's actually, you can see it. This Sanskrit word, Arya Astangika Marga, means an 8 appendaged wheel, if you will. So there are 8 actually spokes on a wheel, right? So what this is representing is the fact that they're all interconnected, right? They're all interconnected, and one does not necessarily have to follow the other. It could be in many different ways. And so the typical image, when you see the image that represents Buddhism, we call it the wheel of Dharma. It has the 8 spokes, which represents the Eightfold Noble Path, right? So again, when we look at this, from this book, Thich Nhat Hanh just briefly touches on it, but he says that we have what we call the threefold trainings. This is a very common idea in Buddhism, is that in order to have awakening, one has to go through what we call the threefold trainings, or sometimes known as threefold practices. And the Buddha, he repeatedly talks about this in his teachings. And they include what we call precepts, concentration, and insight. Okay? Shila, Samadhi, and Panna. Okay? Precepts are basically the ethical moral beliefs that Buddhism talks about. And it helps us, it prepares us so that we can concentrate. So by following these precepts and rules, one can then concentrate better. This is actually the physical, generally it's considered the physical actions that help us in our journey, if you will, spiritual journey. So when we chanted today at the beginning, chanting is one of those. In the Eightfold Noble Path, we talk about right speech, right? Right speech, right action, and right speech. And right action and right speech are the physical elements that help us get to a deeper concentration, right? So when we chant, and I've mentioned this before, chanting has that action of making us focus more on the moment. So when we are chanting, we start forgetting about all the other thoughts that we had prior to coming into this session. And we are able to focus more onto this particular session. And so the chanting is an example of right speech as well. Of course, right speech, there are many other aspects to it, and Thich Nhat Hanh also mentions that in his book. It's like, don't do idle talk, don't lie, etc., etc. But all these things help us. What it's doing is it's creating our bodies to able to advance in the path that we're on. Okay. So if we look at this as when we go back to examine those nutrients or nutriments, right? Positive language, and we hear this today in our modern age. We hear about how if a child is raised with criticism and negativity, they will have an inferiority complex. Whereas when the child is nurtured with compassion and positive comments, they'll grow to be a very confident individual. So what we say is very important, and that is the part of this precepts, following these precepts. Okay. And then samadhi, concentration, is the controlling of the mind. So where our physical body and our speech then goes to our thinking, we then control our mind, the way we think. So if we have the right speech and the right actions, then our thoughts tend to follow that as well. And we start thinking in the proper way. So when we talk about right and wrong, when we talk about the Eightfold Noble Paths, we use terms like right speech or right thought. This is not necessarily right and wrong as good and evil, but there is a right way of thinking and there is a wrong way of thinking. Okay, so it's not necessarily good or evil, but it's just that right way of thinking is more of a wholesome. It helps you. It makes you feel. Helps us see things as they truly are. Okay, and then through that concentration, we get into what we call the insight. We transcend our thinking, and this is when we start coming into what we call the absolute, when we're able to see things as they truly are. So the analogy of the wave in the ocean, the wave can actually realize that they are part of the ocean. This is when they acknowledge the fact that they are a wave, but at the same time, they are the ocean itself, right? So this happens through our, and according to Thich Nhat Hanh, it is through the training, the meditation, the mindfulness, all of this he talks about in the book. Another way of that this is often referred to is through teaching, practice, and attainment. Okay, it's referred to sometimes as teaching, practice, and attainment. So when we talk about precepts, we're following teachings basically, right? And then from when we follow those teachings, then there's a practice that follows that. And finally, through that practice, you have an attainment that comes about. And I'll get back to this again in a bit. But when we look at the Eightfold Path using these threefold trainings, we can then sort of break it down, and it's often broken down in the following manner. So, and the Eightfold Path, they overlap when you start looking at these threefold trainings. So under the precepts, you talk about right speech, right action, right livelihood, and right effort. These things help us. We're creating the atmosphere, we're creating the direction for us to concentrate. And so through that, you have the concentration. And here, right effort is also under the concentration. Right effort, right mindfulness, right thought, right concentration. Right mindfulness, Thich Nhat Hanh also says that it is also, following the precepts is also part of right mindfulness as well. So I could have had that up there as well. And under insight, you get right view or understanding and right thought. Okay. So on one hand, we could say through the speech and action, one could focus on the Dharma, which may ultimately lead to the insight or understanding. However, at the same time, when one has insight or understanding, then one maintains focus or concentration, and this affects their speech as well. Okay, so there are different ways of approaching. Like it's not linear. You don't have to go through this one particular direction or this series, if you will, in order to have awakening. But sometimes when we see the list and we see right views or understanding as the first, sometimes we get into this trap of thinking, oh, I have to understand first before I can do the practice. Okay, but in fact, there are examples in the teachings that talk about people who may not have had the understanding first, but they went through their action first in order to get that understanding. Okay, and so probably the most famous example of that is this story of Suddhipantaka. And some of you have heard me talk about Suddhipantaka before. He was, so Suddhipantaka was not your brightest individual, and he and his brother decided to become disciples of the Buddha, right? And his brother was, the very bright, very athletic, could do whatever, and was sort of the person admired by the villagers. So when his brother decided he wanted to become disciple of the Buddha, everybody thought, oh, that he would make a wonderful disciple. But when Siddhi Pandaka said that he also wanted to become a disciple, everybody thought, oh, you're not that bright, so that might not be a good thing. My brother above me is also somebody who was very capable. He was the valedictorian of his class, and I know how Siddhi Pandaka feels because I wasn't as gifted as my older brother. But anyways, so Siddhi Pandaka is allowed to join the Sangha, and he has difficulties memorizing even 4 lines of the sutra. So he was having a real difficult time, and people were telling him, oh, maybe he should quit. And the Buddha happened to overhear this one day, and so he gives Siddhi Pandaka a task. He said, your task is to clean the courtyard every day. And so Siddhi Pandaka does this for many years. And it's the same thing every day. He cleans the courtyard every day. And every morning he gets up, he notices there's leaves that are scattered about and sweeps up all the leaves and the dust and then cleans it up. And the next morning he gets up, the same thing, there's leaves on the ground, etc. And after doing this for many years, it suddenly dawns on Siddhi Pandaka that this courtyard is his inner self. Every day he cleans it, tries to clean it, but every day more thoughts, the sufferings come out in his thoughts. And so it's said that Siddhi Pandaka, over these many years, he finally comes to realization or awakening. So in this case here, you have a very concrete example of how the right action had led him to the awakening, if you will, right? It wasn't that he had an understanding beforehand, but it was through his action, doing it daily over and over, through his dedication, his effort, right effort, that he was able to have this attainment or awakening. So when we think of the Eightfold Noble Path, as I said, it's thought of more as in this wheel concept, that any one thing could lead to the other, and all of them are benefited by one. Okay, so if you start with the right speech, if we start chanting actually is very interesting because you would think, we chant over and over and over. And for myself, when I went to study in Japan, it's now over 30 years ago, but wow, that's a long time. When I went to study in Japan, Japanese is not my native language. So I had some difficulties, and when I chant the various chants in Japanese, and this is the case for most Japanese as well, I had no idea what I was chanting, right? But over the many years, now, having chanted the Amida Sutra over and over and over again, it sort of seeps into you. And as I chant it now, I can almost see the descriptions of the Pure Land and what the Buddha is saying. And so here's a case where through chanting, the teachings have sort of seeped into the body. So through repetition, it becomes a part of who you are. So when we look at the Eightfold Noble Path, as I mentioned, it's not in this linear direction where it says you have to do this and this and this, but it's more like this wheel where everything is sort of supporting one another, and it helps us understand the ultimate, if you will. It helps us come in contact with the ultimate. So through each of these relative actions that we might be doing, we then go beyond the individual or each individual action, and we come in contact with the truth or reality as it is. So it's now 8 o'clock, and I will send this out to all of you. Do you have questions so far about what I've talked about? Anybody have questions? And you could unmute yourself.
Hi, Sensei. It's Michael.
Yes,
I had a thought. I was wondering if in having relative truth and absolute truth, could you also draw a parallel between relative truth being similar to samsara and absolute truth being similar to nirvana?
yes, and so Thich Nhat Hanh talks about this as well. Is he'll mention the fact that depending on the teaching that the Buddha talks about, so in some of the teachings, like the Heart Sutra, for instance, where he says, there is no suffering, or samsara and nirvana are the same, right? So you can look at it from one perspective and see that suffering and enlightenment are flip sides of, well, this is what we often say, birth and death are two sides of a coin. And so, yes, relative and absolute are like samsara and nirvana. So at certain times, it's important for us, well, actually, it's imperative for us, because we are sentient beings. We can't really, the absolute is so abstract, it's beyond our comprehension. But we only get to know about it through the relative truths that we see. So the moment I say samsara and nirvana, I've already pigeonholed it into a concept where it actually is not, oh, I meant to mention this. One of my favorite movies is the movie The Matrix. Okay. How many of you have seen the movie The Matrix? Yeah. Okay. It's a very Buddhistic movie, actually. Okay. But one of my favorite lines in that is there's the if you haven't seen The Matrix, well, I liked it myself, okay, but I don't want to say you should go and see it, because you might find it violent or whatever. But in this movie, there's a particular scene where the main character, played by Keanu Reeves, he's actually only a day off from me. He's September 2nd, I'm September 1st, and he's one day younger than me. Anyways, that's beside the point. Keanu, who goes by the character Neil, he goes to see what they call her the Oracle, and she's sort of the seer, or truth seer, and he's going to see her because he's thought of as being the one, the chosen one, if you will. Okay, he's going to find out the truth to what we call this matrix. So he goes to go and see this oracle, and she looks at him, and the line that she says is, "Being the one is like being in love. No one can tell you you're in love. You just know you are." Right? So I like particular line because it sort of talks about like the absolute as well, enlightenment. No one could, you could describe it as much as you want, but that's not the same thing as really experiencing it, right? So the same thing with love. You can't tell somebody you're in love. They just know they are. So being the one is sort of like that. You just know you are, right? So the Buddha, he's Eightfold Noble Path is a way for him to describe a path that you can use as a tool to gain that experience that he experienced. So we have to understand that this is just a tool, is what it is, the Eightfold Path. All the teachings are, in fact, just a tool. Because what we have to do is go beyond that tool. Did I lose you? I may have lost you in that.
No, that was really good.
Yeah,
Thank you, Sensei.
yeah,
So,
thank you very much.
any other questions or? Well, if you have any questions and you think about it, you could either email me or even ask the following week. So what I wanted to do next week, I'm not going to talk about the Eightfold Path anymore because I think we've gone through that enough, and we've you know, a lot of the stuff that he talks about in the Eightfold Path are very specific. Like he talks about, you know, mindful meditation and how you go through the different steps of the meditation. And I don't want to go, I don't think that's really necessary to go through. But what I'm going to do next time is go into the second part, or the third part, I guess, part 3, into some of these other teachings. And I started that today with the two, the ultimate and the relative, right? So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Also, I wanted to mention that, so Greg Chor had mentioned on Saturday when we had the special lecture from Miyaji Sensei, Greg Chor had mentioned how we've been going through this particular book, but I haven't really touched upon this in context with Jodo Shinshu, or the Pure Land. And partially the reason why is that Thich Nhat Hanh did not touch the Pure Land in this book as well. Okay. But I did want to let you know that, so one of the things, after I get through that section on the other basic teachings, what I would like to do though, because in the Buddhist teachings, the Buddha says, near the end of his life, you know, he goes back to this Four Noble Truths, Eightfold Path, and it's then when one of his disciples asks him, you know, it's called the Tathagata Garbha, and it's one of his last teachings, and the disciples asked him, he said, you know, all these years you've talked about different teachings, and now you've come back to this Four Noble Truths. So what are we supposed to think about those other teachings you've taught throughout all those years? And the Buddha tells him, in fact, so one of the things he tells him is that the Buddha is basically compared to be like a doctor, in that the doctor does not prescribe the same prescription for every single patient he sees, right? He prescribes it according to the ailment that individual has, right? So similarly, what the Buddha said is that his teachings were based upon the individuals that he was talking to. So he would teach in a specific manner depending on who the audience was, right? So what he does say, though, is that within every one of his teachings are elements of this Four Noble Truths. So what I want to do after I get through some of the other basic teachings is see how in the Pure Land teachings, where the elements of the Four Noble Truths come out in the Pure Land teachings. Because one of the things that we don't do that well in Jodo Shinshu temples is we don't tie together the teachings of the Four Noble Truths, for instance, with Pure Land teachings. When we talk about the Four Noble Truths and Eightfold Noble Path, most people say this is actually part of what we call the Theravada Buddhism. Okay, that the Theravada, or the way of the elders, the southern Buddhists, the Buddhists in Sri Lanka, Myanmar, all those Buddhists are what we call the Theravada Buddhists, and they say that they follow the Eightfold Noble Path more than the northern Buddhists, which are the Buddhism, the Mahayana Buddhists that went to China, Korea, Japan. But I think, personally, I feel that we need to have some tie to this as a fundamental teaching of the Buddha. If not, then Pure Land Buddhism ceases to become Buddhism. And so what I'd like to do after I go through some of the other basic teachings, we'll then go through how the elements of this Four Noble Truth exist even within our Pure Land Buddhism, or how we can understand it using through Pure Land Buddhism. So I hope to be able to go there. And by that time, hopefully we'll be finished within. Once I get into Pure Land, it might take longer again. We might take a little break. Yeah. What I might do is go through the basic teachings and then take a little break and then go on how Pure Land examines it. But those, because I'm sure you're getting bored of listening to me.
No.
No.
If nobody has any other questions, or does anybody have questions? No? Okay, well, thank you all, and we'll just close with the Nemu. So please join me in Gassho. Namo Amida Butsu.
Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu.
Thank you very much. And I will post this on our website as well. I actually forgot to record one of the sessions, so one of them is not on there. But I will post this one, and I will also send out the information that I talked about. Okay?
Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Oh, Greg, you were on it, Greg.
Yes, I was. I sort of half split,
So
but thank you.
That was a fair comment you made on Saturday about the fact that we haven't really touched on the Pure Land Buddhism in this talk. And I will try to get there. Okay.
No, it's great. It's going good, and I really enjoyed the Saturday things as
Yeah.
well
Yeah.
with Reverend Miyagi.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night.